Randy Reinstedt, born and raised in Monterey. Went through the local schools, although I'll be the first to admit I wasn't really a very good student. I was more interested in having a good time than learning all sorts of things, including California history. But I somehow made it through the local schools, and I was involved in all sorts of, student body this and that, and playing tennis and that kind of stuff, which made me decide, well, maybe I'd go on to MPC, which I did, and didn't take college prep at the schools. I tried Spanish and algebra and all that good stuff, just couldn't cut it. And got through MPC, was class president and commissioner of rallies and assemblies and all that. And in turn, San Jose State took pity on me and decided they wanted what they called a well-rounded student. So I hustled up the hill like a lot of the locals did back in the 1950s. And went through San Jose State, got my degree, and became supervisor of recreation for the Greater Vallejo Recreation Department after college. And while I was there, I met a guy who was into travel. And to make a long story short, I ended up working for him as a courier, and I took people to Europe and the Orient, Hawaii, around the world, things of this sort. And that's what opened my eyes to what an incredible area I was lucky enough to be born and raised in, and made me realize how little I really knew about my own hometown. And I got to thinking back to my fourth grade buddies. California history was introduced at the fourth grade level in California. And it was the most boring subject of the day, we just dreaded it. And I thought, wow, that's really sad, because Monterey is California history. Is there a way I can make a difference? And that's what got me thinking about going back to school, picking up my teaching credentials, coming back to Monterey, requesting fourth grade, and seeing what I could do about getting the kids hooked on local history. And that's exactly what I did. I ended up teaching for 15 years, fourth grade, for the Monterey School District. And the books that the state handed down, the state adopted texts, were just deadly. They were just as boring then as they were when I was going to school. And I got to thinking back to when I was, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and I had a paper route in Monterey, and a bunch of the old timers, the chief of police, a bunch of really neat people, the older generation, as I called the wrinkled generation, were on my route. And we got to be friends. I had this route for 4 years, and in those days you had to go and knock on the door at the end of each month and collect the money for the paper you delivered. And I got to know these people pretty well. They'd always ask, well, how's school? And how's this? And school's boring. I don't like school. And they'd say, gee, that's really sad. When we went to school, and then they started telling me all these stories. And I started thinking, I should incorporate some of these stories. They told me about the bandits and the treasures and the shootouts and the fishing industry and Bobo the sea monster and, all this kind of stuff. And I got to thinking, that's probably the way to teach local history. And so I started collecting these stories. I tracked down more, just really literally hundreds of old timers, and collected their stories over the years. And the kids were just hooked. And in fact, the school I taught at, we had 4 fourth grades, and the other teachers weren't into local history. So we departmentalized, and I ended up teaching all 4 fourth grades California history. And it turned out to be the favorite subject for these kids. And the other teacher was saying, gee, Randy, can you jot some of these stories down so if we transfer next year, we can share some of the stories. The kids can't stop talking about it. And that's, in a sense, what led me to writing. I started recording these stories, jotting these things down. And then along came Monterey's bicentennial, 1970. And I was asked to do an article for one of the local magazines. And I thought, they wanted me to write about the old buildings along the path of history and stuff. And I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. And along the way, I got to thinking, gee, no one's going to read this unless they're a history nut. Who wants to read about a bunch of old buildings? And that's when I got to thinking again about these stories, about the ghosts, about the bandits, about the treasures that were connected and lost in and around these buildings. So I did the article. It was called Ghosts of Old Monterey. In fact, I had so many stories that they had to run it in 2 installments. And it just really caught the imagination of the people on the peninsula. And literally my phone started ringing after that. And people wanted to talk to someone who wouldn't put them down. They wanted to share stories, things they'd experienced, mainly ghostly type things. And so I started writing a lot of these things down, collecting them, and pretty soon I had so many of these things, more so than the ones that I had used in the article. So I brought out a little book called Ghosts of Old Monterey, which eventually after that was sold out, it became Ghost Bandits and Legends of Old Monterey. And each time one of these publications came out, you know, that just started my phone ringing all over again. People would literally stop me. I'm walking down Alvarado Street. You're the guy that wrote the ghost books. Yeah, well, let me tell you what happened to me type thing. And this led to a second and a third and a fourth. I think I've done 8 books on local ghosts now. None of these stories are made up. These are all things that have happened to people in and around the Monterey Peninsula. It's just unbelievable, the stories that these people have. And, you know, I'll be the first to admit that a lot of these are probably just made up or embellished along the way. People that have probably read too many scary ghost books or seen too many scary TV shows or films and imagine they saw all these things. But there's so many people who have been so involved with their experiences that you can't call these people liars. You can't say that they're hallucinating. They're not on drugs. They're not, you know, these are things these people have experienced. A couple of times I've even been with people while they've experienced things, while we were at the different places where these incidents in fact took place. So what I'm leading up to is, you know, I'm not into ghosts. I'm not a psychic. I don't study this. I'm not into the supernatural. But I'll be the first to admit that there's something going on that we don't understand. Call it what you want. Maybe ghost is a bad word. A lot of people, they hear the word ghost and all sorts of scary things get conjured up in their minds. They're thinking about stories they had heard or things of this sort, films they've seen. And that's really not the way it is. A lot of these experiences, these ghostly experiences, you know, they're good. It's a comforting feeling that there's something, a spirit, whatever, watching over these people. It's just incredible. The building that probably has more ghost stories connected with it on the path of history is the Robert Louis Stevenson House. And this is on Houston Street, a little short, 1 block long street in the heart of Monterey. A lot of locals have never even been there. They don't even know it's there, let alone got into it. And probably the best known ghost connected with this building is the so-called Lady in Black. In fact, not only has she been written up by me and local stories, but she's been written up in the New York Times. I mean, this ghost is really well known. She, the Lady in Black, is probably one of the best known ghosts in the Central California area. People from all over who are into ghosts are aware of the Lady in Black. Probably the best known story, which is really not spooky, so to speak, but it took place way, way, way back. I mean, I think we're talking 1960s. And the curator, very, very, very dedicated lady, very knowledgeable about Monterey history, the Robert Louis Stevenson House. She was a walking encyclopedia about the Stevenson House. I mean, not only did she know all there was to know about the building, but she knew all there was to know about Robert Louis Stevenson. And for Stevenson enthusiasts, they ought to go there. There's all sorts of Stevenson memorabilia there. It probably has the biggest collection of Stevenson family pieces of any place. I mean, even his home back in Scotland. I mean, this is incredible. Anyway, late one afternoon, she was about to close, and part of the ritual of closing up the building was walking through the building, checking the buildings, making sure everybody was out of the building and all the windows and the doors and everything were secured. And she was walking down the upstairs hall. And as she got down to the end of the hall, and she glanced to the left, which was the children's nursery. And I should mention that in front, at the entryway from the hall into these rooms, there were these cell-like bars that had been put up, almost like a jail cell door. And the reason that was done is because back in those days, the building was open to tourists, and they would walk through on their own. They would be greeted by the guide at her desk at the entryway, and the guide would share stories about the building and a little bit of information. And they were free to walk through the building on their own and just sort of soak up the atmosphere and stand as long as they want in front of these barred doors and look at the rooms and just sort of visualize what it was like. She's walking down the upstairs hall, and she gets to the end, and here's the children's nursery. And there's a bed, and there are all sorts of children's toys and things like that. And she glances in to the nursery as she's walking, got all sorts of things on her mind, things she had to do after work after she closed and things of this sort. She wasn't really thinking about what she's doing. She'd done this hundreds, probably thousands of times. She glances into the room, and she sees this lady who was standing at the foot of the bed. And the lady was standing with her hands behind her, and she was dressed in this black dress, this big old black dress, back Victorian style dress, and she had a high black lace collar. Her hair was up in a bun, and just like the ladies of long ago. And she was standing with her hands behind her. She was just looking down into the bed. And the lady, the guide, it didn't dawn on her that nobody could have been in there. She was thinking about other things. And she stopped and she said, it's time to close. You're going to have to leave. The lady turned and she smiled at the guide and acknowledged that she had heard what she had said. And with that, the guide turned and was about to go across the hall into what they call the sunroom. Just then, she took about one or two, maybe two steps, and she realized, wow, this is impossible. Nobody could be in there. She spun around and looked, and the lady was gone. She had totally disappeared. To this day, that lady thinks that what she actually saw was the ghost of Manuela Jardine, who was the lady that owned the building in 1879 when Robert Louis Stevenson stayed there. And 1879 was really a hard year, a bad year for Manuela. Her husband died, and she had to, in turn, to bring in some money, she had to, in turn, rent rooms in the building, and it became known as the French Hotel, or the French House. Different sources describe it differently. And what she thinks, also her grandchildren, two of her grandchildren became very, very sick with a fever that spread through Monterey County. And according to some sources, they almost died. And she thinks that what she saw was the ghost of Mrs. Jardine, who had come back to the room and was standing there looking into the bed, watching over her two grandchildren who were so sick. They eventually got well, by the way, and it was a happy ending to the story. But again, we could go on and on about Stevenson House stories. But that's number one.